We've covered most of the Pacers free agency topics, but what happened around the league that the Pacers care about in terms of talent moving around, talent in their division or conference moving around? How does it impact the standings? What does it all mean for the Pacers? We'll get to it all today on the Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Thursday, everybody, and welcome into another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name's Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and SI, and today, lots to get to on the free agency front, but not about the Pacers specifically this time. I think we've covered every topic about the Pacers' new acquisitions, their players out the door, all that sort of stuff. But what else happened around the league that the Pacers care about? How did the balance of power shift? Where did the players go? And how are the standings impacted, and specifically the Pacers' spot in the standings impacted by what happened? We'll get to it all today, and this is perfect timing because I've been doing a lot of research on the player movement and what it means for the league for a project, and no time better than now to dive in to what it all means for the Pacers. And this has been an interesting thing that someone who I was kind of talking about this all with were discussing, and that is where the talent in the NBA, really went this summer and what that means for the Pacers and Eastern Conference teams in particular. And I think this is where I would like to start this project off, right? If you go to looking at free agency and specifically players who switched teams, right? Players who didn't switch teams don't impact the balance of power as much around the league or impact other teams as much, but where players actually shifted talent. There were 18 players who signed a contract with an average annual value of $4 million or more who changed teams. Bruce Brown being one of them. He's on the Pacers now. And there were 17 other guys among that group. Everyone below $4 million, some of them aren't minimum contracts, but a lot of them are. They're not as important to the structure and power balance and standings of the NBA. So I just went with these guys to say, like, these are rotation level guys who will get minutes or just, they're more impactful to the landscape of the league. So 18 of them switched teams, right? And those 18 are, to be quick, Fred VanVleet, Bruce Brown, Dillon Brooks, Max Strus, Grant Williams, Dante DiVincenzo, Dennis Schroeder, Gabe Vincent, Joe Ingles, Georges Niang, Jeff Green, Jock Landale, Javon Carter, Shake Milton, Jalen McDaniel, Seth Curry, Taurean Prince, and Troy Brown. Those 18 players all switched teams via free agency this summer. I know that some of them are sign and trades. That's still a free agent signing effectively for their new team. So if you didn't catch something important there, I'm going to remove Bruce Brown from these numbers because he's on the Pacers, which obviously impacts the Pacers. They're a better team. Bruce Brown is on their roster, and he wasn't last year. But looking at the other 17 guys, I hope you all notice an important theme there, and that is how much of that talent went to or stayed in the Western Conference. 18 names there. Bruce Brown is one of the 18. So of the other 17 names, 5 of those names are a good player or a talented player who switched teams in free agency that went from the Eastern Conference to the Western Conference. Chief among this list would be Fred VanVleet, the best player who switched teams in free agency going from the Toronto Raptors to the Houston Rockets. That makes an Eastern Conference opponent that the Pacers will play at least 3 times this coming season much worse. That's a former All-Star in his 20s changing teams. Fred VanVleet, a very good player who changed teams. A rotation player for the conference finalists and 2 years ago NBA finalists, Boston Celtics, is now at the Dallas Mavericks. Grant Williams, he has switched teams and conferences. Yes, that was also a sign and trade, but the Celtics did not get significant talent back, and that they got picks back. That is a big shift of talent, and it hurts the rotation of a team in the Pacers conference. Shake Milton went from Philly's rotation, backup guard, to the Minnesota Timberwolves. That is not like the most talented player ever, but certainly hurts Philly, who's kind of in a holding pattern and has less guard depth. Gabe Vincent, a starting guard for the NBA Finals team, the Miami Heat, has gone from the Heat to the Los Angeles Lakers. That, of course, temporarily hurts the Heat. Obviously, they have a bit bigger aspirations at the point guard position, and we'll cover that if and when the time comes. And then Seth Curry, who had a really rough year last year, but still can be a threat with his shooting, went from the Brooklyn Nets to the Dallas Mavericks. Mavs actually get 2 of these guys who go from east to west. So some of the marquee names who switched teams went from east to west. That's good for the Pacers. Their conference is worse. Their life is a little bit easier on the schedule as a result of that. And we'll talk about some of the teams near or around the Pacers in the standings as we push on through the show. But I just thought all that was very noteworthy, that some of the big talent shifts went east to west. And even beyond that, some of the other good players in this free agency went west to west. I will say this is the group that is probably the weakest of all the shifts you could talk about from Western Conference to a different Western Conference team, but to actually change teams. This group is Dylan Brooks. He stayed in the West. Jeff Green, Jock Landale, Taurean Prince, and Troy Brown. They all switched teams from a Western Conference team to a Western Conference team. That obviously is a little less beneficial to the Pacers, but it still means those players are not in the East and playing the Pacers as often. Dylan Brooks, despite all what has happened this offseason, is still a talented player. And all those guys are going to be in the rotation for their new teams. So that's still beneficial in general for the Pacers. That is not West to East talent. That is just the other way around. In fact, West to East talent was the smallest group of these 18 players who got $4 million or more annual value who changed teams. There are only 3 players who were on a Western Conference team last year that are now in the Eastern Conference. And that's Dante DiVincenzo going from Golden State to New York. That's obviously pretty significant. He's probably the best player, too, who did such a switch from the East to the West. 4 years with the Knicks, too. They're set up pretty well to be good in the future and make a star trade. That is, of course, significant to get more talent in the door. Dennis Schroeder, who goes from the Los Angeles Lakers to the Toronto Raptors. He'll probably start for the Raptors, getting the full MLE from them. They lost Van Vliet. He's fine. He's a fine player, but significant downgrade for Toronto. And the other one also went to Toronto, and that's Jalen McDaniels, who is now with the Raptors. And that is wrong. He was with the Sixers to end last season. So that's actually East to East, excuse me. So actually only 2 players went west to east. I confused him with Jaden, who was on the Minnesota Timberwolves. The other 4 players who switched teams that I haven't actually said yet stayed in the East, and that's Max Strus, Joe Ingles, Georges Niang, and Javon Carter. So that actually should be 5 players who stayed in the East, and only 2, excuse me for my on-the-fly talking here, who went west to east. So that's a little worse than I originally said, but in general, actually still sticks with the point I had of the talent drain in actual free agency of players moving from team to team much more benefited the West than the East, and the best player who went from West to East is Bruce Brown, who's on the Pacers now. So obviously that move impacts them in a positive way, unlike the rest, which is a little more of a negative in terms of the shifting powers of the conference. So the thesis I took from that, and I've already said it a bunch, but I thought it was important, is the talent went west. And that, if you look at the standings in general and the way that it looks like the Western Conference is going to be, like, the Spurs are probably slow playing this with Wembanyama, sure, but outside of them and Portland, every team in the West is going to be hoping to take a step forward or trying to be as good or better than last year. Who knows what'll end up happening with Utah and Houston, but it seems like every team in the West has grand aspirations this year. They all got better. They all want to be better. They all moved assets and actions around that suggest they want to be better, and no team nosedived in the West. No team in the West, well, Portland is going to. They haven't yet. But no team, as it stands in the West, has intentionally put themselves in a worse situation with a long-term outlook, which is unique. Portland, again, is going to, if the Dame trade happens, whatever, they will be worse, and clearly aiming for the bottom. But that's unique, that whole conference going for it. The East, now I've also said this about the East. The East has a lot of teams that will be going for it this year. In fact, before the Wizards traded Beal, I actually was thinking, is every team in the East going to be trying to be better than last year this year? And now the Wizards are obviously a team who got worse. The Raptors got worse. And there's a couple teams near the bottom of the East, Charlotte, Detroit, that, they probably will try to be about the same, maybe a little bit better. In Detroit's case, we will see. Now, that theme of shifting of power from East to West is not just limited to free agency. The trade market also showed a similar theme, which is totally fascinating. I'll cover that and look at the standings of teams around the Pacers, who they could move close to, and we'll do more in depth on that next week, plus some other stuff that didn't happen that is potentially relevant to the Pacers as we continue through today's show. Before we dive into all that, I want to really quickly talk to you guys about FanDuel. FanDuel, take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets, up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think is going to be the first home run, all in an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/LockedOn. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. The Spurs just got campaigned. They have Victor Wembanyama. They've been wheeling and dealing. Their team is really interesting. Listen to Locked On Spurs for your second listen with Jeff Garcia to get the latest on the San Antonio pro basketball team, who now has campaigned, which is certainly a trade that happened, and is not one we'll be talking much about in this coming part of this discussion, looking at the landscape of the league after some of these moves, right? Overall, I think the Pacers will be happy to see the talent shift go west more than east. In fact, only two significant west to east free agents in DiVincenzo and Schroeder. Now, let's look at the trade aspect of this, because this is sort of similar, although there weren't a lot, like it felt like it, but there weren't a ton of significant talent shifting trades this year, funnily enough. There's a lot that's been talked about, but none of them have actually happened yet. There's been big trades. For example, Kristaps Porzingis, very good player, was awesome last year for the Wizards, and is now in the East and on a better team. So his impact specifically is, one, still in the East, and two, maybe more actualized in a way that hurts the Pacers, but a team that has the exact same record as the Pacers last year, the Wizards, a team they would like to climb over as they quest for better in their conference. Well, hey, that is easy, mostly because the Wizards just got worse, but also because the Pacers got better, because Porzingis is no longer on their team. In fact, entering the final day of the season, the Wizards had a better record than the Pacers, so you could say that they were better, air quotes, for more of the season. Now I think the Pacers have jumped them with the Porzingis trade. We'll talk more about that later, but also part of the Porzingis trade, the player who went west in that trade was Marcus Smart, who's good. He went from Boston to Memphis. So that is talent drain from east to west. And the exchanging player who went from west to east was Tyus Jones. Tyus Jones is very good. To be clear, Marcus Smart is better. That is a talent win for the West and good news for the Pacers. Now, the Celtics getting 2 first-round picks is, of course, significant for what the East landscape could look like in several years. In fact, I think that trade should be very scary to any team who wants to be near the top of the East in the next 5 years, because the Celtics could be extremely well set up for that span. But in general, currently, right this second and heading into next year, that talent exchange, I think, will be one that benefits the Pacers and makes the East a little bit weaker. You know who else went from East to West? Probably the best player traded so far, Bradley Beal. Bradley Beal from the Wizards to the Suns in that giant trade. Jordan Poole's on the Wizards now. Lots of other stuff obviously happened. But hey, Bradley Beal goes east to west. Good news for the Pacers. They play Bradley Beal one less time per year. And in that exchange, Chris Paul went from east to west. This one's cheating. He went from the west to the east for like a couple seconds, like time seconds, not second rounders, and then back to the West. So he's not in the East. You could call him not a premier talent anymore. I would disagree. I thought he was pretty good for a lot of parts of last year, despite, yes, having the worst season of his career. Either way, he's not in the Eastern Conference. So that full exchange was significant for the Pacers. Trades have treated them well this summer, as well as free agency, with Beal and Smart and Paul staying west. And even like one of the better players traded in a minor trade, John Collins. John Collins goes east to west, and that salary dumperoo that the Hawks did with the Utah Jazz, Rudy Gay, not nearly as good as John Collins. In fact, he's probably one of the weaker players in the NBA this coming season. He's in the East now instead of the West. So obviously I get why the Hawks did that, but I understand that that's better for the Pacers, who now have to play a potentially weaker Hawks team. We'll talk about the Hawks later in the show as well. So a lot of decent guys kind of hovered around the East or came to the East, and Monty Morris and Gary Harris stayed in the East. They're decent, but the talent drain, if you combine both trades and free agency, is definitely net win for the West. The West had more talent go to it from the East than the other way around in a lot of those moves. If you're an Eastern Conference team who's hoping to ascend this year, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, basically all of them, except the Washington Wizards, then yeah, you're happy to see that happen. And the Pacers are among that group that's happy to see that happen. Their life got a lot easier, especially because they, unlike some of these other teams, were one of the ones that benefited the most significantly from that player movement. They didn't just add draft talent, they also signed a good free agent and were active in the trade market. Toppin, I didn't think was quite the significant enough of a talent to be mentioned in this breadth of discussion, but he's obviously much better for the Pacers than the Knicks and could be one of the guys who's talked about as a significant move this summer, right? So in general, he went east to east in a positive way for the Pacers. I think they'll be happy with how the player movement all shook out in the NBA and what that means for them this coming season. Some other stuff didn't happen in terms of moves that could matter for the Pacers, I would say. For example, the Dallas Mavericks have not landed a high-quality center yet. They have been rumored to be interested in Clint Capella for a long time. Dwight Powell is going to play center for them. They have Derek Lively. He's young and should be good in the future. They have JaVale on their team still, Maxi Kleber, Rashawn Holmes. Like, they have decent centers, but they're all more backup levels than starter levels. There's a reason they're interested in Capella. If things go terribly for the Pacers and they need to make a trade, or if the Mavs come with a crazy good offer, perhaps, there could be a deal to happen between the Pacers and Mavs with a center trade, or even Daniel Tice could help them if there's injuries to the Mavs, for example. Like, looking at veteran teams who want to be good and have holes at positions that the Pacers could fill is an important exercise. The Mavs still need a center. The Lakers, they lost a shooter in Malik Beasley. They've rumored to have interest in Buddy Hield. In fact, they agreed to a trade for Buddy Hield before the Westbrook thing happened a couple of years ago. Again, I'm not saying the Pacers will be trading any of the players I'm about to mention. This is just stuff that I registered as like, oh, interesting. When thinking about the league landscape and what it could mean for the Pacers, that was one of them. Lakers lost a shooter in Malik Beasley. They definitely got talent in the door that will help them. In fact, they had one of the better free agencies in general. To me, Gabe Vincent's going to be great for them. But they lost a shooter in Malik Beasley. That could be something they have to figure out how to recover from. Taurean Prince in the door for them. He's good. Perhaps he could end up being a valuable shooter for them. But as it stands, I think that they lost some shooting if they ever need to add some during the season. The Boston Celtics lost a ball handler. And their only real kind of... They're not a bad passing team, but for the best team, among the best teams in the league, they're maybe the worst passing team. They don't have great setup men in general. I think that is a little bit strange in general as they head into next season, and they have a good guard rotation. Derek White's great. Tatum and Brown can play the guard spots. Brogdon, obviously a good player. Like, they have good guards on their roster. Peyton Pritchard will probably have a bigger role this year, but if they want a floor general type, I don't know if they would or wouldn't, but they don't have one right now. I thought that was interesting. And a big talking point among people in Vegas was the Celtics offseason and the fact that they changed their identity despite being a pretty good team. Well, what will that look like for them as this season goes? The 76ers lost some talent. They lost Jalen McDaniels in free agency, for example. They have a million random centers on their team. They're just in a weird spot. They're a weird roster right now. Perhaps they could just need any talent that... they'd have to also be under the tax at some point this season, given how close they are. But any talent to Philly seems like it could be a deal that happens in the future. And who knows what happens with Harden. That could obviously influence what the Philadelphia 76ers what to do. Again, what I'm reviewing right now is moves that didn't happen that I feel like could be meaningful for the Pacers later if any of these teams want to make a move at some of these positions in the future. The Raptors lost point guard Fred VanVleet. Obviously, they got Dennis Schroeder in the door. They also, lost Delano Banton. Delano Banton not in my $4 million plus tier of player, but they lost him. And so their point guard rotation significantly weaker. The Celtics got Banton, so maybe that's their ball handler that I just mentioned earlier, but I thought that was significant that the Raptors may be in need of a point guard or a guard in general as the season continues. A lot of teams that were kind of deeper in the standings in the West could use shooters. Minnesota, Phoenix, although they can't trade anything hardly. The Clippers, they could all use a little bit more shooting. Clippers have a lot. They're a good shooting team, but those teams felt like they didn't add enough there yet. In fact, the Clippers had a very quiet offseason. Suns can't really do anything, so Minnesota's really the one that I thought was interesting there. But just the absence of some stuff matters, right? Looking at what those teams did not do and what that could mean for their future desires in trades or moves, I thought was a relevant exercise to see how that impacts the Pacers and what they could be considering for the rest of the offseason or really up through February, right, as the trade deadline will approach during the season, and the absence of those moves matter. That said, Kelly Oubre is still out there. Christian Wood is still out there. Like, these teams that need shooters or wings or bigs, there's still options for them. I think there's still some dust settling going on among these star stuff that could happen. We'll see what that means for those moves for the Pacers, for any other deals that could happen this offseason. So what does all this mean? All this stuff that did and did not happen for the standings, and specifically the teams around the Pacers. The Pacers say they want to make the playoffs next year. Can they catch these teams around them that did or did not? Let's take an enhanced look at those teams right around the Pacers to get a better feel for that. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Pacers your first listen today and every single day. For your second listen, check out Locked On Wizards. I talked about them getting worse this offseason already. They are a very new look team, very different team. The Locked On Wizards guys will break down what that roster looks like. Plus, Miles Turner was just on Gilbert Arenas' podcast. We'll talk about that later this week. And Gilbert Arenas played for the Wizards. So go check out Locked On Wizards for your second listen today. Let's look at the teams close to the Pacers in the standings. In fact, the teams that finished within 10 games, that's a wide band, within 10 games of the Pacers in the standings last year, and if the Pacers could catch them or be caught by them in the regular season. And I'll throw in another team that the Pacers were technically not within 10 games of, although they finished basically exactly 10 games away from this team, just to see, okay, could the Pacers actually move? How much will they actually move in the standings? Really, I'm going to do all the teams that are within 8 games, and then the 10-game team is Brooklyn. That's a big change in record, to be clear. And for more on this topic, by the way, that I'm about to dive into, next week, Matt Moore is going to join from the Action Network. He also hosts Locked On Nuggets to talk about the East in general, teams the Pacers could catch, teams that they could fall behind, what the win totals look like. That'll be one of the earlier shows next week that I'm looking forward to, because the Pacers want to make the playoffs. Well, they got to be one of the best 8 teams at least, and the play-in tournament means 6, really, but also top 10 gives you a shot. We'll see. The state of the East is a relevant topic, and Matt and I will break that down next week. For today, though, I want to look at the moves of the teams close to the Pacers in the standings, man. So this is the teams within 8 games of the Pacers, plus the Nets, who are within 10 games, but are a unique circumstance that we'll actually get to. So let's go inverse order from the standings last year with the Hornets. The Hornets finished 8 games worse than the Pacers, 27-55. They got Miles Bridges back. That makes them better. They drafted guys. They'll definitely be healthier next year than they were last year. LaMelo Ball should play way more than he did last year. Assuming they retain P.J. Washington, they should just be better, right? That's a team that I don't know if they can get, whatever the Pacers' growth in wins is. Let's pretend it's 5. It's likely going to be a little more than that, but that would mean the Hornets have to win 14 more games. Like, is that feasible? Maybe not that many more, but they should be a better team, and one the Pacers actually have to think about in terms of what the standings look like and what the Hornets could do as they chase them on their heels. Hornets shouldn't be a playoff level team this year, but they should be better and a tougher opponent, and someone the Pacers will actually have to think about as this season progresses. And I would say, this is relevant too, they're on the Pacers timeline. So seeing the moves they made specifically matters to the Pacers. They're one of those teams that is hoping to ascend at or near the timeline the Indiana Pacers are. So seeing how they operate, what they do, is relevant to the Pacers. Another team on the Pacers timeline in this swath, the Orlando Magic, who started off awful last year and then were actually pretty good for the rest of the season and finished the year with a better point differential than the Pacers. They were 34-48. Had the Pacers lost their final game to the Knicks, they would have had the exact same record the Magic and the Pacers would have. They're on a similar timeline in terms of their young guys and their top talent. Banchero looks like he's a year behind Halliburton or 2, but it's similar. They got Joe Ingles. That was their big addition and really their only meaningful addition. But their young guys should all be better. So similar to the Hornets, they should be a little bit better team. Will they catch the Pacers? Maybe. They actually are good enough to do so, I think, with the talent and infrastructure that they have. But they could be a little ricketier as a younger team in general in their rotation than the Pacers will be. The team immediately tied with the Pacers in the East, the Washington Wizards, they got way worse on purpose. Unlike a team we'll talk to right after, the Washington Wizards, the Wizards got worse. Pacers should be better than the Wizards this coming season. They lost Beal, they lost Goodwin, they lost Morris, they added Shamet and Poole. That's a talent loss. They kept Kuzma. They got Tyus Jones in. They got Gallo. They got Muscala. Like, they're not going to be an embarrassing team. I think people are a little overlooking that they have like a rotation that is like good NBA players. They're just a worse team than last year, certainly. So that is a team the Pacers should stay ahead of. They also lost Porzingis, obviously. So that is a team the Pacers should stay ahead of and have no trouble getting ahead of, unless Poole is way back to playoff Poole from 2 years ago, and some other guys have big seasons for them. The Pacers should be better than the Wizards this year, which is a part of this other moves that impact them this summer. The Raptors, the team that finished the one spot ahead of the Pacers in the standings, 41-41. They got worse, but not on purpose, like the Wizards. They lost Fred VanVleet, obviously. They also lost McDaniels. Excuse me, they added McDaniels. They lost Fred VanVleet. They lost Delano Banton. They got McDaniels and Schroeder. That's worse. They're worse. They will get better in other ways. They still have Siakam. They still have Anunoby. Scotty Barnes should be better. They kept Pirtle. Like, they're going to be at least a 30-something win team, and they're very motivated to win. They do not have their first-round pick this coming season unless they're in the top 6 of the inverse standings. So they're going to be very motivated to win and try to get better still. So I don't think they're going to fall as much as some think, but I think they're a catchable team for the Pacers given how their offseason went and how the talent suck kind of hurt what ended up happening to them. So the Wizards, the team right behind the Pacers, got worse on purpose. The Raptors, the team ahead of the Pacers, got worse on accident. The Bulls, the Chicago Bulls, they also finished with 40 wins. They're ahead of the Raptors in the standings because they won their play-in game, but they were worse. They were 5 games ahead of the Pacers, although they were very much neck and neck until the very final stretch when the teams picked different directions. Bulls, I'd say they stayed the same. They mostly kept their guys. They lost Patrick Beverley. They kept most of their guys. They added Javon Carter and Torrey Craig, which is helpful. They needed defense. They needed toughness. Those are good additions to their team that will fit in well with what they're doing. They're going to be older in a lot of ways. So if they get the Zach LaVine they had for the second half of last season for the whole season, they'll be better. By default, he was awesome, but they're not going to have Lonzo all year. Some of their other guys are going to age up. So maybe Patrick Williams and LaVine and all these guys can get a little bit better and their additions will click and they can win 40 to 45 games, but I would not say that puts them out of reach for the Pacers at all. So I think they are a catchable team. I think the Pacers improved more than the Bulls did, if they improved at all. The Heat, the Miami Heat, shrug, TBD on what the Heat will be next season. Obviously, if they make the move that everybody thinks they will make and assumes they'll make, yeah, they'll be a much better team. They'll maybe be one of my favorites in the East next year. But so far, in the absence of acquiring Damian Lillard, they have lost Max Strus, they have lost Gabe Vincent, 2 starters from their finals team. They lost Cody Zeller, who was their backup center on their finals team, and Omer Yurtseven, who was the other backup center for them. And they got Thomas Bryant and Josh Richardson, who are fine players. I'm happy for Thomas Bryant to have that opportunity. So far, probably a bit of a talent loss for the Heat, who, yeah, they made the finals, but they only won 44 games. But if they get Dame, they're obviously going to be awesome. And Bam should be better next year because he's still young. And if Hero's on their team, he'll be better because he's still young. They're still going to be good. They're going to be not easy to catch despite losing talent to me. Atlanta, Collins out, John Collins out, Patty Mills in, Rudy Gay in. That's kind of it. They haven't done a lot because money's been tight for them. They drafted players too. All these teams I've talked about drafted players, but I don't think those guys move the needle that much. The Hawks probably are a little bit the same, that they have a lot of young guys who should and could get better. Okongwu should and could get better. Murray extended. He's still youngish. He could get better. AJ Griffin's awesome. Like, they've got talent that will help them improve this season despite not adding a ton. So they'll be fine. They'll be about the same, if not a little bit better of a team. And then the last one, this team is outside of that 8-game band, but they're within 10 games and their context is totally different. That's the Brooklyn Nets. They finished 10 games ahead of the Pacers last year, but they had a big buffer from a hot run when they had KD and Kyrie on their team. That's not the case anymore. They finished with barely a positive point differential. They finished with a worse point differential than Chicago and Toronto last year, right? So I think they're not as good as their record suggested last year already, and the talent change, their context means they should not be considered a team with a baseline of 45 wins. And so all that to say, they lost Patty Mills, they lost Joe Harris, they lost Seth Curry, they lost Yuta Watanabe, right? Those are some good players. A lot of those guys were in the rotation for a lot of last year. They added Dennis Smith, they added Lonnie Walker, they added Darius Baisley. So they have some talent coming in. Mikal Bridges will have a nice role. They kept their important players. They'll be good. They'll be a good team. But the exercise here is that I think they're catchable, right? They're a catchable team for the Pacers potentially in the standings, in that they don't have the best creators ever. They're kind of reliant on their 3-and-D wings to be awesome on D this year. And maybe their goals are, Claxton takes a step forward. Their young guys look fantastic. Dinwiddie with a summer to work with their guys is a better creator. And that's all very possible. And this is just a little bit of just surveying their talent. But I think they have lost a little more than they've gained in terms of talent. And they obviously lost KD and Kyrie during last season. I think they're a catchable team. And I'll go through this full exercise with the East next year with Matt Moore in terms of over-unders, who the Pacers could or couldn't catch, what they should look like in the East standings, all sorts of stuff. But that's all the moves I think impact the Pacers and what the current landscape of the East actually looks like right this second. Let me know if you disagree or agree with any of this by either, if you're watching on YouTube, commenting down below, or if you're on Twitter, tweet at me at TonyREast. People seem to love to do that recently, which is good. I like interacting with listeners and readers. Thank you guys a ton for listening today. Tomorrow, we will be talking about, I should have had this up before I started talking. Tomorrow, we'll be talking about lots of podcast appearances from Pacers players this week. Tyrese Haliburton, Bruce Brown, and Miles Turner all have spoken on the record. Tyrese Haliburton with Paul George, Miles Turner with Gilbert Arenas, and Bruce Brown is a part of the Title League's production. So lots to get to there. We'll talk about O'Shea Brissett's era in Indiana and what it will look like potentially for him heading to the Boston Celtics. And then next week we'll get into a little more evergreen stuff as we transition into the slower period of the offseason. Hope that's all good with you guys, and I hope you enjoyed today's show. Be back tomorrow. Till then, everybody, have a fantastic day.